Hello, I'm Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network. Hard talk with a matrix of newsmakers. The headlines. The conflicts in Ukraine and Syria have renewed debate over how much hard power Europe needs to stabilize its own neighborhood and to protect its interests. But how much is EU hard power stymied by austerity-stricken governments who can't spend the 2% of GDP some say is needed to create a viable defense? Reluctant to spend more, will Europe continue to rely on American-run NATO? And can they always count on it? The U.S. was scaling back into the latest crises. Or should Europe only be seeking soft power political solutions with diplomacy and humanitarian aid, not waste money on new hardware? Now, wired into this edition of the network here at the European Parliament in Brussels, Michael Gahler, a German member of the center-right European People's Party group in the European Parliament, Philippe Lamberts, Belgian co-chair of the Parliament's Greens European Free Alliance in the Parliament, and Paul Even, policy analyst with the European Policy Center and a former diplomat. Welcome to all of you. Let's start with a question to all of you, starting with Michael. Can you really have a strong foreign policy without a strong army? Can you really gain credibility with only soft power?
We need the entire toolbox from a verbal note to a fighter aircraft. And that means that we, in the current circumstances, first of all, we need to stop cutting defense spending, then use the available funds better by common planning and common procurement.
Okay, Philippe, what's your position on that?
Well, that the military is part of the toolbox, that's quite undeniable. Yet the question is, how much bang do we get for our buck?
Yes.
And, well, when we have 28 national defense budgets, that's probably not the best way to extract value from our investment. So the question is, maybe not do we need to spend more, but maybe do we need to spend better?
Paul, do we need to spend more?
Well, I would say that we need to do both spend more and spend better.
How much more? Do we need 2%?
I mean, that was one of the commitments, that's one of the figures that was discussed, and the member states committed, well, in the framework of NATO to spend. At the same time, we're talking about foreign policy. The world outside the EU does not follow EU rules. And it's not a postmodern world, it's a world in which we have wars. So it's clear that the EU has to adapt to that.
Okay, we have to spend more, but there are some countries that are saying, well, look, I can't spend more. I'm stuck with a stability pact that's keeping me from spending more. The Italians, for instance, would like to suspend stability pact rules on its defense spending. What do you think, Philippe?
Well, that's probably not where I would start. I mean, if governments have to spend money from flexibility of the Stability Pact, probably it's more on the social issues, because, well, what we risk is an internal explosion rather than an external attack. So probably we should put the priority there. Okay,
Michael, Stability Pact out the window when it comes to defense?
It's two different issues. I mean, I just said it's about better spending. It's about also adapting our structures to the needs. For instance, we have an Athena financing mechanism which doesn't suit the purpose. It prevents countries who cannot pay all the costs of an engagement, and therefore they abstain and put the load on others. So we need to reform in this regard, that we can make use of what we've got.
Okay, reform, but it's going to take time. I think we've seen that there's been general support for NATO. Should Europe continue relying on NATO as it has? Because the Americans have been saying, look, we might not always be here. Philippe.
Well, probably we should then refocus our spending. If I take two major military spenders in Europe, the UK and France, a significant chunk of their expenditures goes to their nuclear arsenal. And, well, this is typically the kind of instrument you don't use and you prefer not to use. So the question is, do you really want to put all your bucks into that basket?
Okay. Do we need deterrence? Do we need nuclear deterrence, Paul?
Well, the countries that do have nuclear weapons definitely believe that they have to keep this, especially since other countries in the world are improving or upgrading the system. It's part of the military tool. At the same time, yes, I think NATO will remain the bedrock of European security, at least in what concerns the security of Europe.
I would argue it's not that much NATO, the US, but it's, for instance, a country like Turkey. We are going to be active in Muslim areas predominantly, and NATO decides unanimously. I do not want to depend EU-wise on NATO provisions and then depend on a veto of Turkey.
Okay, speaking of that region, should we be sending weapons to moderate rebels in Syria and in Syria, for instance?
I think in north of Iraq, with regard to the Peshmerga, I have supported that because there it is foreseeable who gets it and who will use it for what purpose. In Syria, it's more difficult. I'm very hesitant.
Philippe, is this where we can assert
I'm just looking at the recent track record. I mean, the US spent tens of billions of dollars equipping the official Iraqi army, only to see it wither from the battlefield.
Do you think it's a waste of money?
Depending who you arm, really. And what is the military game plan in order to secure, security on the ground? And, so far I've seen no credible plan for Syria, for instance.
Okay. Paul, very quickly, is this something we're throwing money at wrong?
Well, it's clear that there needs to be a clear strategy of how to do this. At the same time, I would say that the Kurdish troops are better organized than the Shiite and the Sunni part of the Iraqi army.
Okay. Back to the European defense. Doesn't Europe need a strong military for peacekeeping as well as peacemaking? Wouldn't that justify really boosting Europe's military, the Euro Corps, for instance, turn it into a real army?
I'm very much in favor. I mean, the Euro Corps has been used even in Afghanistan, but not under EU command. It has been used by NATO and others, and it could serve as a nucleus for the future European army. We are deciding unanimously, so we can also unanimously decide on having such.
So it's stayed a nucleus
structures.
for years. Philippe, should it go any further?
There's two conditions for this to work. First, before we have a joint tool, do we have a joint vision? And what I see is that many European member states are still diverging widely as to what their view of the strategic landscape is. Second, we have very different rules of engagement. In Germany, you need the Bundestag to concur to a commitment, and I like this. I think that we need democratic legitimacy for these decisions. In France, it's the president who decides. We have to have the same process across Europe to engage common troops.
Okay, then Paul, is this what actually condemns Europe to being unable to have an assertive defense policy, military policy, because of all these different kinds of ways the governments work?
I would say that clearly one of the problems is this lack of a common vision, lack of a common strategic culture. We see big differences between the member states of the European Union on this, and Mr. Lamberts mentioned some of these examples. We still have a security strategy, European security strategy, that it's now 11 years old. We should definitely update that. The new challenges there in the world much more serious than they were 11 years ago.
Michael, yeah. What's held us back from that? We've been talking about this for years.
But what held us back, there was not really the feeling that we have too little money. There wasn't really the feeling that the US is disengaging, and there wasn't really a feeling from an outside threat. And now we got it all three: too little money, US disengaging, and the external threat. So I think that is the time to get us moving in this regard.
Okay, Philippe, do you think that's going to happen? Do you think we can see something? I think 2015 is supposed to be some kind of decisive year where there will be a decision on this.
Well, there's a chance that the ball gets rolling, and I would really start with a common vision thing, because again, if you have a common instrument and no common vision, you'll never use the instrument.
Okay, and if we ramp up this defense, we heard from Mr. Schäuble in Germany recently saying this is the wrong signal to send to the Russians right now. What do you think, Paul?
Well, I think the Russians do pretty much what they want, not respecting what Europe does. I don't think Europe should prepare its defense depending on what Russia wants.
Okay, Paul, as a fellow Christian Democrat, what do you think?
Mr. Schäuble is definitely not against more European defense. But before we take the step to increase defense spending, first let us stop cuts in defense and let us better spend the existing money, and then we'll see where we are.
Would you agree with that, Philip?
Yeah, I would think that we should start pooling capabilities and building capabilities together. Again, duplication is widespread in Europe, and we are missing in some areas, air refueling, intelligence, etc.
Okay, last question to you, Paul. We're 100 years after the beginning of the First World War. We're about 70 years after the end of the Second World War. Do you think that Europe will ever have the stomach to have a strong military, considering that history? This could be a whole day discussion, but quick.
I think it will take a long time until we'll actually have a European army as such. We will continue to have, for the foreseeable future, national armies that could work better or worse together. So I think we should focus on how to make them work better together and to have the capabilities, some of them mentioned by Mr. Lambert, to actually do missions, for example, in the neighbourhood, in Northern Africa, in the Sahel, without necessarily having to ask for the help of the Americans.
Perhaps a bit of common ground here. Thanks, Ivan. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Michael Galler, Philippe Lamberts, and Paul Even. I'm Chris Burns, and until next time, thanks for connecting with the network.